There is a reason you've never fully relaxed inside this world. Not socially, existentially. You've achieved things, you've failed at things, you've blended in when necessary. But there has always been a quiet fracture running underneath the surface, a subtle sense that you are participating in a reality that doesn't entirely match your internal depth. Most people bury that sensation. They call it mood, or personality, or anxiety. They medicate it with distraction. But what if that fracture is not a weakness? In 1888, a woman living in London published a 2-volume work that most people found unreadable. Her name was Helena Petrovna Blavatsky. The book was The Secret Doctrine. It did not offer spiritual comfort. It did not promise salvation. It outlined a model of reality in which consciousness evolves in stages, and not everyone occupies the same layer. She claimed humanity is not uniform in awareness, that individuals stand at different points within a vast evolutionary architecture, and when an emerging level of consciousness outgrows its surrounding structure, tension appears. That tension can feel like alienation, like displacement, like being slightly out of rhythm with your time. Blavatsky was attacked, ridiculed, and dismissed in her era, partly because her framework implied something destabilizing. The world you see is not the full structure of reality, and the self you think you are may not be your deepest layer. If that is true, then feeling out of place is not pathology. It may be pressure. Pressure from expansion, and pressure, when misunderstood, feels like isolation. So before you reduce your unease to personality, consider a different hypothesis. What if you are not misfitted to reality? What if you are transitioning within it? Let's examine that without superstition, without fantasy. Let's examine it structurally.
Chapter 1. The Fracture. There is a specific kind of discomfort that doesn't have a clear source. It's not loud. It doesn't collapse your life. It doesn't make dramatic scenes. It sits underneath everything. You can function. You can work. You can socialize. You can even succeed. But somewhere beneath performance, beneath routine, beneath obligation, there is a quiet observation running in the background. This doesn't quite fit. Not the job, not the city, not even the people. The structure. You move through conversations and feel like you are translating yourself into simpler language. You listen to debates that seem urgent to others and sense that the argument itself is built on shallow premises. You watch the way people chase validation, status, distraction, and you can participate, but something in you remains detached, not superior, detached. And that distinction matters. Superiority is ego. Detachment is perception. Most people interpret this fracture incorrectly. They reduce it to personality traits. They say you are introverted, or overly analytical, or emotionally sensitive, or socially misaligned. But those explanations treat the symptom as identity. What if the symptom is structural? What if the sensation of being slightly out of place is not a psychological malfunction, but internal reorganization? In 1888, Helena Petrovna Blavatsky proposed something that, at the time, sounded outrageous. She argued that consciousness unfolds in layers and that humanity does not occupy a single uniform stage of development. According to her framework, individuals stand at different degrees of awareness within a vast evolutionary architecture, not morally superior, not spiritually chosen, structurally distinct. The idea unsettled people because it undermined a comfortable assumption that we are all operating from the same depth. We are not. Observe carefully. Some people are driven almost entirely by immediate survival and social positioning. Their focus is on external reinforcement, approval, competition, accumulation. Others begin to question the structure itself. They question why systems are built the way they are. They sense the fragility of consensus reality. They detect contradictions others ignore. That shift is not cosmetic. It changes how reality feels. When your perception deepens, environments optimized for surface interaction begin to feel thin, not wrong. Thin. There is a difference. You may have noticed this during moments of growth, a phase where what once excited you suddenly felt trivial, a conversation that once stimulated you now feels repetitive, a goal you pursued intensely loses gravity. It can feel like boredom, or depression, or cynicism, but sometimes it is compression before expansion. When internal architecture reorganizes, the previous structure becomes too small. The discomfort you interpret as alienation may actually be spatial. Your awareness has outgrown its container, and when awareness outgrows the container, friction appears. Friction is not dramatic, it is persistent. It appears as fatigue in environments that once energized you. It appears as irritation at conversations that once felt normal. It appears as restlessness when routine becomes predictable. You may try to override it. You may tell yourself you are being difficult, ungrateful, detached. But the sensation does not disappear. It follows you into new contexts. You change circles. The fracture remains. You change careers. The fracture remains. You adjust behavior. The fracture remains. At some point, you begin to suspect the issue is you, and perhaps it is, but not in the way you assume. Blavatsky's framework did not romanticize this. She did not suggest that individuals at deeper layers of awareness float peacefully above society. She described evolution as tension-filled, as disruptive, as destabilizing. Expansion does not feel like a celebration, it feels like isolation before integration. Consider something practical. When a child's cognitive capacity increases, previous toys become unsatisfying. The child does not hate the toys, they simply no longer stimulate the expanding structure. Now apply that to consciousness itself. If your perceptual depth increases, if you begin to see systems rather than events, patterns rather than incidents, your environment may begin to feel simplified in comparison. This is not arrogance. It is a mismatch. And a mismatch generates pressure. Pressure is often misdiagnosed as loneliness. You can be surrounded by people and still feel unaligned. Because alignment is not about presence. It is about resonance. Resonance requires similar structural depth. Without it, interaction feels like compression. That compression is exhausting. You may notice that you require more solitude than others, not because you dislike people, but because solitude allows recalibration. In solitude, your internal architecture is not negotiating external expectations. Again, not superiority. Calibration. The danger at this stage is misinterpretation. Some individuals respond to depth mismatch by withdrawing permanently. Others respond by performing shallowness to maintain belonging. Neither resolves the fracture. The first isolates growth, the second suffocates it. Blavatsky's suggestion was neither withdrawal nor conformity. It was awareness of position within an evolving system. If consciousness unfolds in stages, then each stage carries a different perceptual bandwidth. Bandwidth determines what you notice. If you notice contradictions in social structures that others accept unquestioningly, you are not necessarily rebellious. You may simply be perceiving at a layer they have not yet engaged. If you sense impermanence where others assume stability, you are not pessimistic. You may be detecting cycles beneath the surface. If you feel drawn toward questions of meaning while others remain absorbed in acquisition, you are not dysfunctional. You may be responding to internal expansion, but expansion has a cost. The cost is friction, with environments optimized for previous versions of yourself. This is the fracture, not dramatic, not catastrophic, just persistent, a slight misalignment between inner architecture and outer structure, and the instinctive reaction is to fix the outer structure, to search for a place where the fracture disappears. But if the fracture originates from internal growth, relocation alone will not resolve it. The deeper question is not, where do I belong? It is, what is evolving in me? Blavatsky framed humanity as unfinished. She argued that we are transitional beings, mid-process within a larger evolutionary arc. If that is even partially accurate, then discomfort is not an anomaly. It is a signal that the previous equilibrium is dissolving, signal that internal architecture is recalibrating, signal that alignment must be rebuilt consciously. This reframes the feeling of being out of place, not as a defect, not as identity, as pressure from growth. And growth, when misunderstood, feels like exile. The mistake is assuming that exile means rejection. It may mean repositioning. We begin here, not with comfort, not with affirmation, but with a possibility that the fracture you have felt for years is not evidence of brokenness. It may be evidence of expansion, and expansion always destabilizes before it stabilizes. Now we examine the architecture itself. Chapter 2: The Architecture of Consciousness. If we are going to treat your sense of displacement as structural rather than psychological, then we need a model that can hold that weight. Not inspiration, a model. In 1888, Helena Petrovna Blavatsky attempted to construct one. In The Secret Doctrine, she outlined a view of existence that rejected the idea of a flat universe. According to her, reality is stratified, not symbolically, functionally. Layers of manifestation, layers of causation, layers of awareness. The physical world, in her framework, is not the starting point. It is the densest layer, the most condensed expression of subtler forces. Beneath appearance lies pattern. Beneath the pattern lies the principle. You don't have to accept her metaphysics to grasp the architectural implication. If reality is layered, then consciousness is not uniform. Uniformity is a convenient assumption. It simplifies governance, it simplifies education, it simplifies social organization, but it does not match the observation. Observe people closely. Some operate almost entirely through impulse and external reward. Their focus is on immediate feedback, approval, threat avoidance, gain and loss. Others perceive longer arcs. They think in terms of systems, consequences, and abstraction. They sense instability, where others sense permanence. And then there are individuals who cannot help but question the foundation itself. They are less concerned with winning inside the system and more concerned with understanding the system's design. These are not personality categories, they are depth categories. Blavatsky suggested that evolution does not only apply to biology, it applies to awareness, and awareness expands through stages, each stage reorganizing perception. If you change the lens, the world changes shape, not physically, perceptually, and perception governs action. Consider a simple example. If you believe reality is random, you respond to events reactively. You blame circumstances. You seek control through force. If you believe reality is patterned, you begin looking for underlying causes. You adjust internal alignment. You study recurrence. Two individuals living in the same environment, operating from different architectural assumptions, will experience radically different worlds. Now extend that further. If consciousness itself evolves, then certain individuals may outgrow prevailing narratives. Outgrowing a narrative does not feel triumphant. It feels destabilizing. The collective agreement no longer feels convincing. Social rituals lose meaning. Goals that once motivated you feel hollow. You begin to sense that most systems are optimized for maintenance, not evolution. That realization creates tension, because once you see a structure, you cannot unsee it. And once you unsee the illusion of uniform depth, you begin to notice dissonance everywhere. Dissonance between words and actions, between ideals and incentives, between stated values and underlying motives. Blavatsky described humanity as mid-transition, not complete, not static, a species in process. If so, then fragmentation is inevitable. Different segments of the population would embody different developmental layers simultaneously. That would explain something obvious, but rarely articulated. Why communication across depth levels often fails. It is not always a disagreement. It is a mismatch of perceptual bandwidth. One person is debating outcomes. Another is questioning premises. They are not even standing on the same layer of inquiry. This creates chronic frustration. If you have ever tried to discuss structural flaws in institutions and been told you are overthinking, you have experienced depth mismatch. If you have ever sensed the fragility of societal stability while others express absolute certainty, you have experienced depth mismatch. If you have ever outgrown a worldview and felt temporarily disoriented because nothing external shifted to match your internal expansion, you have experienced an architectural transition. Transition is rarely celebrated. It is disruptive. It dismantles old certainties before new ones stabilize. Blavatsky's model implies that awareness does not leap from one stage to another smoothly. It destabilizes the previous equilibrium first. That destabilization can feel like isolation, because equilibrium is social. Societies are built on shared assumptions, shared myths, shared frameworks. When your internal framework shifts, you temporarily step outside consensus. Consensus provides comfort, but comfort and evolution are not synonymous. Evolution introduces asymmetry. You may begin noticing that conversations repeat familiar scripts. That outrage cycles predictably. Those trends replace reflection. That urgency substitutes for depth. And once noticed, these patterns are difficult to ignore. The risk here is arrogance. The mind quickly converts depth mismatch into superiority. That is a regression, not progression. Blavatsky did not frame evolution as a hierarchy of worth. She framed it as a stage of awareness. A child is not inferior to an adult. They are operating from a different cognitive layer. Similarly, individuals operating from surface-driven consciousness are not defective. They are stabilized within a stage. But if your internal architecture has shifted beyond that stage, pretending otherwise creates strain. This strain manifests in subtle ways. You may feel understimulated in environments that once energized you. You may crave complexity while others prefer simplicity. You may feel urgency about questions others consider irrelevant. You may sense the impermanence of systems that others treat as eternal. All of this can be misdiagnosed as dissatisfaction. But dissatisfaction implies an expectation unmet. Architectural transition implies a structure evolving. The difference is critical. Dissatisfaction seeks replacement. Transition seeks integration. Blavatsky's layered model suggests that awareness deepens by incorporating previous layers, not rejecting them. This is where many fail. They attempt to sever connection with earlier stages entirely, rejecting society, rejecting institutions, rejecting participation. But architecture does not function through rejection, it functions through integration. Higher layers stabilize only when they incorporate lower ones coherently. If you abandon practical life in pursuit of abstract insight, instability follows. If you suppress expanding awareness to maintain social acceptance, stagnation follows. Integration is the task, and integration requires understanding what is actually shifting. Your fracture is not random discomfort. It may be a sign that your perceptual bandwidth has expanded beyond the framework you are currently inhabiting. That is not the end of belonging, it is the beginning of reconstruction. Before reconstruction can occur, however, you must examine the evidence within your own experience, not hypothetically, practically. We move next into the signs, the measurable indicators of depth mismatch, so this remains grounded, not speculative. Because if architecture is real, it leaves traces, and those traces are visible in your daily life. Chapter 3. Signs of depth mismatch. If this fracture is structural, it must leave observable evidence, not vague feelings, patterns. The first sign is perceptual fatigue. You notice that certain conversations drain you disproportionately, not because they are hostile, because they are repetitive, predictable, surface level. You can anticipate the conclusion before the argument finishes. You can detect the underlying incentive beneath the stated position. You hear performance where others hear passion. Over time, this creates exhaustion, not social anxiety, cognitive exhaustion. You are processing multiple layers simultaneously, while others engage only the top one. The second sign is early disillusionment. At some point, often younger than those around you, you stopped believing in structures that most people take for granted. You saw the fragility of institutions, the transactional nature of praise, the instability of trends, the temporary nature of public consensus. This did not make you cynical, it made you cautious, but caution isolates, because enthusiasm is contagious, skepticism is not. The third sign is difficulty with unquestioned authority. You do not reject authority reflexively, you examine it. You look for structural coherence. You test consistency. If the structure does not hold, you detach internally, even if you comply externally. This creates a silent distance in environments that reward obedience. The fourth sign is sensitivity to contradiction. You detect when stated values conflict with actual behavior, when public narratives diverge from private incentives, when social movements mask personal gain. This detection is rarely welcomed, because most systems depend on selective blindness to function smoothly. Your perception interrupts smoothness. The fifth sign is periodic isolation that does not originate in insecurity. You withdraw not because you feel inferior, but because you feel misaligned. Solitude becomes recalibration, not escape. You return to social spaces strategically, not compulsively. This is misunderstood frequently. Others may interpret your withdrawal as arrogance or mood instability, but internally, it feels like pressure equalization. The sixth sign is discomfort with purely transactional ambition. You may pursue achievement, you may pursue wealth, you may pursue influence. But if those pursuits lack structural meaning, they begin to feel hollow quickly. The moment you recognize that the game itself is shallow, winning loses its intensity. This confuses people around you. They may assume you lack drive. You do not lack drive. You lack interest in empty frameworks. The seventh sign is long-term pattern recognition. You see cycles repeat, socially, politically, economically. You detect that outrage follows predictable arcs. Those trends accelerate and decay in patterned intervals. That public opinion swings rhythmically. This makes it difficult to become emotionally engulfed by temporary waves. You may appear detached, but you are observing from a higher vantage point of the pattern. The eighth sign is discomfort with identity performance. You feel resistance when pressured to reduce yourself to a label, political label, cultural label, professional label. You sense that identity categories are surface constructs, useful but incomplete. This does not make you apolitical or disengaged. It makes you cautious about over-identification, because over-identification collapses depth into a slogan. The ninth sign is restlessness during stability. When everything appears externally secure, you may feel an unexpected unease. This is often misdiagnosed as self-sabotage, but sometimes it is anticipation. Anticipation that the structure will shift, because if you perceive cycles, you expect transition. Comfort feels temporary. You prepare internally before the change becomes visible. The 10th sign is this. You suspect that your life has phases that cannot be explained purely by circumstance. Periods of compression, periods of expansion, moments where internal shifts precede external change. You sense sequence beneath randomness. Now pause. None of these signs implies superiority. They imply depth variation. Blavatsky's layered framework would interpret these not as personality quirks, but as markers of developmental transition. As consciousness reorganizes, perception recalibrates. As perception recalibrates, the environment feels altered, even when unchanged. This is critical. Most people attempt to resolve depth mismatch by modifying surface variables: new location, new relationship, new aesthetic, new social group. Sometimes that helps temporarily. But if the underlying architectural shift continues, mismatch reappears, because the source is not geography, it is the perception bandwidth. Bandwidth determines resonance. If your perceptual field expands, environments optimized for a narrower bandwidth create distortion. Distortion feels like friction. Friction sustained feels like exile. Here is the danger. Once you recognize these signs, the ego will attempt to weaponize them. It will whisper that you are more evolved, more aware, more advanced. That interpretation collapses architecture into vanity. Evolution does not inflate. It refines. If your awareness expands, your responsibility expands with it. You cannot simply criticize shallower structures while benefiting from them. You must learn integration, and integration requires restraint. It requires the ability to engage surface layers without being absorbed by them. It requires the ability to communicate across depth differences without contempt. That is far more difficult than isolation. This is where many fail. They mistake expansion for exemption. They detach permanently and call it awakening. But Blavatsky did not frame evolution as escape from humanity. She framed it as participation at increasing levels of awareness. Depth without contribution becomes stagnation. Contribution without depth becomes noise. If you recognize yourself in these signs, do not rush to label yourself. Observe. Observation stabilizes transition. Ask yourself, are these patterns consistent across time? Do they intensify during growth phases? Do they calm when alignment increases? Treat your experience as data. If the fracture is structural, it will behave consistently. And consistency indicates architecture. We now move into a more uncomfortable territory. Because if depth mismatch is real, then society itself may be structured in ways that resist expansion. And that has implications far beyond personal discomfort. Chapter 4. Why Society Feels Shallow. If your internal architecture has shifted, the next logical question is not, what's wrong with me? It's, what kind of system am I embedded in? Because friction is relational. It arises between structures. Modern society is optimized for stability, not depth. That is not an accusation. It is a design feature. Large populations require coordination. Coordination requires simplification. Simplification requires shared narratives that most people can adopt without prolonged reflection. Efficiency favors surface clarity over philosophical nuance. This is why slogans outperform complexity, why speed replaces contemplation, why is consensus often built on repetition rather than investigation. Stability depends on predictability, and predictability depends on reducing variance. Depth introduces variance. An individual who questions foundational assumptions slows systems designed for momentum. Someone who examines underlying premises disrupts workflows built on surface agreement. From the perspective of the system, that disruption is inefficient. From the perspective of evolution, it is necessary. This tension is ancient. Blavatsky argued that civilizations move in cycles: expansion of consciousness, consolidation of order, eventual rigidity, and then collapse or transformation. When systems become too rigid, they resist adaptation. Individuals who sense fragility early are rarely celebrated. They are labeled pessimistic or disruptive. But pattern recognition is not pessimism. It is structural awareness. Look at any modern institution, corporate, political, educational. Their design rewards compliance with existing frameworks. Advancement typically requires fluency in the system's language. Fluency is not depth. It is aligned with the current architecture. If your awareness begins detecting cracks in that architecture, contradictions, inefficiencies, fragilities, you may feel uneasy participating enthusiastically. That unease is often interpreted as disillusionment. But disillusionment simply means illusion dissolving. The problem is not that society is shallow in an absolute sense. The problem is that mass systems cannot function at maximum depth for everyone simultaneously. Complexity must be tiered. Most institutions operate on surface layers because those layers are scalable. Depth does not scale easily. Reflection is slow. Mass culture is fast. Contemplation is selective. Mass participation is broad. If you feel exhausted by constant information cycles, it may not be because you are fragile. It may be because rapid surface stimulation conflicts with deeper processing. Modern systems reward immediacy. Depth requires latency. You think in longer arcs. The environment rewards short bursts. That mismatch creates friction. You may notice that public discourse rarely addresses root causes. It focuses on symptoms, emotional triggers, immediate reactions. Structural critique is often dismissed as impractical. Yet, without structural critique, systems stagnate. This is where depth becomes uncomfortable. If you sense that society prioritizes surface engagement over long-term coherence, you will experience chronic tension, not because you reject society, because you perceive its limitations. Blavatsky's cyclical model suggests that every civilization reaches a point where its stabilizing mechanisms become restrictive. When order becomes rigidity, evolution slows. Individuals who begin questioning that rigidity are often misunderstood, not because they are wrong, because they are early. Early awareness rarely feels triumphant, it feels isolating. If you have ever tried to articulate structural concerns and been met with indifference, you understand this. Most people are not resistant out of malice. They are invested in stability. Stability feels safe. Depth destabilizes. The irony is this: society depends on both stabilizers and expanders. Stabilizers preserve order. Expanders introduce adaptation. Without stabilizers, systems collapse prematurely. Without expanders, systems calcify. If you experience depth mismatch, you may occupy the expander position. But expansion without grounding can become chaos. That is why integration matters. Blavatsky didn't advocate withdrawal from society. She described humanity as co-creative within evolutionary cycles. Co-creation requires engagement. You cannot reshape architecture from outside the building. Yet, engagement without awareness becomes conformity. This is the tension. How do you remain structurally aware without becoming structurally antagonistic? How do you operate within systems you recognize as partial? The first step is removing the illusion that society is designed for maximum depth. It is not. It is designed for functionality. Functionality prioritizes average compatibility. If your perceptual bandwidth extends beyond the average range, you will frequently encounter compression. That compression is not personal rejection, it is a systemic limitation. Understanding this reframes resentment. Instead of blaming individuals for not perceiving what you perceive, you recognize that they may be operating at a different stabilization layer. Blavatsky's layered consciousness model implies that awareness expands unevenly across populations. This unevenness is not a flaw. It is a process, but the process generates friction, and friction generates discomfort. The mistake is assuming that discomfort must be eliminated. Sometimes it must be understood. If society feels shallow, the impulse may be to detach entirely. But detachment alone does not advance architecture. It isolates depth from application. Application is crucial. Depth must translate into contribution. Otherwise, it becomes a private observation without structural impact. So the question becomes, how do you live within a system optimized for stability while embodying an awareness oriented toward evolution? The answer does not lie in rebellion for its own sake, nor in assimilation. It lies in conscious participation, which requires internal coherence. And internal coherence requires confronting your own layers, not just society's. Because depth mismatch externally often mirrors incomplete integration internally. We now move to a more demanding section, not society's limitations, yours. Because if your awareness has expanded, you carry responsibility equal to that expansion. And responsibility is less comfortable than alienation. Chapter 5. The Psychology of Evolutionary Friction. Depth is destabilizing, but destabilization alone is not growth. There is a dangerous transition point in expansion, a moment where perception sharpens, systems appear fragile, and ego quietly begins to reinterpret awareness as elevation. This is where architecture collapses inward. Blavatsky's model of layered consciousness is frequently misused. People extract the hierarchy and discard the integration. They assume that perceiving structural flaws makes them structurally superior. It does not. Seeing cracks in a building does not make you the architect. It makes you an observer. The distinction matters. If you have begun perceiving depth mismatches in yourself, in society, your first task is not critique, it is calibration. Because depth without integration fractures internally before it reforms externally. Notice what happens when you detect superficiality. Do you withdraw with clarity or with contempt? Do you engage selectively or disengage entirely? Do you refine your communication or abandon it? Expansion increases perceptual bandwidth, but bandwidth requires stabilization. If your awareness widens faster than your emotional regulation, you will feel overstimulated. If your structural insight deepens faster than your humility, you will feel inflated. If your detachment grows faster than your compassion, you will become isolated. Evolution is not an escape from human limitation, it is a refinement of it. Blavatsky described evolution as layered, not linear. Each stage incorporates prior layers rather than annihilating them. This is where many misunderstand expansion. They attempt to discard earlier versions of themselves, their ambitions, their relationships, their practical concerns, in pursuit of abstraction. But architecture does not stabilize by rejecting its foundation. It stabilizes by reinforcing it. If your perception has expanded, you must integrate that expansion into daily conduct. How do you handle conflict? How do you allocate attention? How do you structure time? How do you respond when misunderstood? These are architectural questions. If you feel out of place, your instinct may be to blame the environment. Sometimes that is accurate. Often it is partial. Depth mismatch externally can mirror internal incoherence. For example, you may recognize societal superficiality, but still chase superficial validation. You may criticize institutional instability, but neglect your own discipline. You may perceive patterns in politics, but ignore patterns in your own reactions. This is evolutionary friction. It occurs when awareness outpaces embodiment. Blavatsky's framework implies that awareness must crystallize into character. Perception alone is unstable. Character stabilizes perception. If you sense that you are transitioning architecturally, your responsibility increases. You must become more precise with speech, more disciplined with attention, more selective with emotional investment. Otherwise, expanded awareness simply amplifies chaos. Consider emotional reactivity. If you perceive depth differences but respond impulsively to shallower provocations, you are still governed by surface layers. Integration requires restraint. Restraint is not suppression, it is structural coherence. When thought, emotion, and action align, friction decreases, even in imperfect environments. If you are evolving, you cannot afford chronic resentment. Resentment anchors you to the very structures you claim to outgrow. Nor can you afford apathy. Apathy collapses expansion into stagnation. The discipline is engagement without absorption, to interact with systems you recognize as partial without internalizing their limitations. This requires clarity, and clarity requires self-observation. When you feel alienated, pause. Is the discomfort arising from genuine structural misalignment or from wounded identity? Is your frustration rooted in depth or in unmet expectation? These distinctions are subtle but decisive. Blavatsky emphasized that evolution unfolds through cycles of compression and expansion. Compression tests integrity. When your awareness expands, you will be compressed by environments not yet reorganized around that expansion. How you respond during compression determines whether expansion stabilizes. If you retreat permanently, growth stalls. If you attack indiscriminately, growth distorts. If you integrate patiently, growth consolidates. Integration looks ordinary from the outside. It does not require a public declaration. It requires private discipline. It may involve building smaller, more aligned circles instead of chasing mass validation. It may involve focusing on long-term coherence rather than short-term applause. It may involve choosing contribution over recognition. These choices are architectural. They determine whether depth becomes structure or remains abstraction. There is another risk: romanticizing isolation. Feeling out of place can become identity. Identity becomes comfort. Comfort becomes stagnation. If you cling to the narrative of being misunderstood, you avoid the responsibility of building understanding. Blavatsky did not describe evolved consciousness as lonely genius. She described it as expanded participation within larger cycles. Participation is the key. If you are evolving architecturally, you must ask, where can this depth serve? Where can it stabilize? Where can it be clarified? Where can it build? Without application, perception corrodes. With application, perception strengthens. This is the turning point. Feeling out of place can become either permanent exile or transitional restructuring. The outcome depends on discipline, and discipline is not glamorous. It is consistent alignment between what you see and how you live. We now move to the broader pattern, the cycles themselves, so that your personal experience is situated within a larger rhythm rather than isolated as an anomaly. Because if architecture exists, it operates in waves, and waves do not apologize for destabilizing shorelines. Chapter 6. The Cyclical Model. Nothing in architecture remains static. Stability is a temporary equilibrium between forces. If Blavatsky was correct in proposing that consciousness evolves in layered stages, then that evolution cannot be constant acceleration. It must move in waves: expansion, compression, consolidation, expansion again. You already know this pattern, not philosophically, but personally. Think back. There are periods in your life where everything expands at once. New ideas, new relationships, new ambitions, energy increases, possibility feels open, you reorganize quickly. Then, without warning, contraction arrives. Enthusiasm slows, friction increases. What once felt aligned begins to feel unstable. You question previous choices, you reassess direction. Most people interpret contraction as failure. It is not. It is structural consolidation. Expansion without consolidation produces instability. Consolidation without expansion produces stagnation. The tension between the two generates development. Blavatsky's cyclical model of evolution extended beyond individuals to civilizations. But the principle scales down. Your career follows cycles. Early ambition expands rapidly. You absorb knowledge. You test boundaries. You push. Then comes compression, doubt, plateau, structural strain. If you misinterpret compression as collapse, you abandon progress prematurely. If you interpret it as consolidation, you reorganize. Relationships follow cycles: initial intensity, discovery, projection, then friction, realization, adjustment. If both individuals evolve, the relationship restructures. If one resists, a fracture emerges. Identity follows cycles. You attach to roles. You inhabit them fully. Then subtle dissatisfaction begins, not dramatic, gradual. The role no longer contains your expanding awareness. At this point, many people cling harder. They reinforce identity to resist transition. But architecture does not stabilize by denial. It reorganizes. When reorganization begins, discomfort is unavoidable. This is the moment where you feel most out of place, not because you are lost, because the old configuration is dissolving before the new one stabilizes. Blavatsky described cycles operating across vast spans of time, epochs rising and falling based on shifts in consciousness. Whether or not you accept the scale, the mechanism is visible in smaller arcs. Systems expand until rigidity forms. Rigidity triggers stress. Stress forces adaptation. Adaptation creates a new equilibrium. If you are experiencing depth mismatch, you may be in a personal compression phase. Your awareness expanded. Your environment did not adjust simultaneously. Now pressure builds. The mistake is assuming pressure equals regression. Pressure often precedes reconfiguration. Think of structural engineering. When the load increases, stress tests the integrity of the frame. Weak supports crack. Strong support holds. The structure adapts or fails. In personal terms, compression reveals where your internal architecture lacks coherence, where you still depend on external validation, where fear still dictates decisions, where identity still clings to outdated forms. Compression is diagnostic. It exposes, it refines. If you respond to compression by numbing yourself, you prolong instability. If you respond by overreacting, you destabilize further. If you respond by observing and adjusting, you integrate. This is the discipline. Blavatsky's evolutionary cycles imply that discomfort is not random turbulence. It is a phase transition. Phase transitions are chaotic at the surface, but orderly at the structural level. Water boils chaotically, but temperature follows a precise law. Your life may feel chaotic during transition, but if you observe carefully, you will detect a pattern. Increased questioning, reduced tolerance for superficiality, heightened awareness of contradiction, temporary isolation, re-evaluation of goals. These cluster together. They form a sequence. Sequence implies architecture. Here is where responsibility intensifies. If you understand that cycles govern development, you cannot dramatize every contraction. You cannot interpret every loss as punishment. You cannot interpret every delay as defeat. You must ask, what is restructuring? What is being integrated? What is dissolving because it no longer fits? You may find that certain friendships dissolve during expansion phases, not out of hostility, out of bandwidth difference. You may find that career paths shift abruptly when internal awareness changes, not because you failed, because alignment shifted. You may find that solitude increases during consolidation phases, not because you are excluded, because recalibration requires reduced interference. The more you observe this rhythm, the less personal it feels, and the less personal it feels, the less defensive you become. Defensiveness is a surface reaction. Structural awareness is a deep response. Blavatsky's cyclical cosmology removes the illusion of permanence. Nothing stabilizes forever. Not institutions, not identities, not civilizations. If you cling to permanence, every shift feels catastrophic. If you recognize cyclicality, shifts become navigable. The feeling of being out of place often intensifies at the edge of a phase transition. The old environment reflects who you were. The new environment has not yet formed. You stand between structures. That space feels unstable, but it is fertile. It is where reconfiguration occurs. If you endure it consciously, the next equilibrium stabilizes at a higher level of coherence. If you panic and regress, you repeat the previous stage. Repetition without awareness feels like fate. Repetition with awareness becomes progression. This is the subtle difference. And now we approach the final escalation. Because understanding cycles is not enough. You must decide what to do with depth. Awareness without responsibility becomes a burden. Awareness with responsibility becomes architecture. We now move into the final section where we confront what depth demands of you. Chapter 7. The Responsibility of Depth. Understanding that you may be in transition is not relief. It is a burden. Because once you suspect that your sense of being out of place is structural, you lose the comfort of victimhood. Victimhood is simple. It says, the world is wrong, I am displaced, nothing can be done. Architecture is not simple. It says, if your awareness has expanded, your responsibility expands with it. Blavatsky did not describe evolution as entitlement. She described it as an obligation. Greater awareness implies greater alignment with law, not exemption from it. If you perceive structural flaws in society, you are now accountable for how you embody coherence within it. If you see superficiality, you must reduce it in yourself. If you detect instability in institutions, you must increase stability in your own conduct. If you recognize cycles, you must prepare rather than panic. Depth that does not translate into discipline collapses into arrogance. and arrogance isolates faster than ignorance ever could. There is a quiet test embedded in expansion. Can you maintain clarity without contempt? Can you maintain engagement without absorption? Can you maintain ambition without hollow pursuit? These are not rhetorical questions. They determine whether your transition stabilizes or fractures. The feeling of being out of place tempts you toward withdrawal. Withdrawal feels clean. It feels like self-protection. But permanent withdrawal stagnates growth. You are not meant to float above architecture. You are meant to participate in its refinement. Participation does not require grand gestures. It requires precision, precision in speech, precision in commitments, precision in attention. Blavatsky described humanity as co-creative within evolutionary cycles, not passive observers, not accidental byproducts. If that proposition holds any truth, then depth is not personal advantage. It is a structural function. Every system requires individuals who sense patterns before collapse. Every structure requires individuals who detect misalignment before fracture. But detection alone is insufficient. You must become an architect, not a critic. Architects do not complain about gravity. They design with it. If society favors speed, you design pockets of depth. If culture favors reaction, you embody restraint. If noise dominates, you cultivate the signal. This is slower than rebellion, but it is more durable. You cannot demand that mass systems reorganize around your bandwidth. You can build environments where your bandwidth stabilizes. You can refine circles that value coherence over spectacle. You can direct your effort toward long-term structural contribution rather than short-term applause. Depth requires patience. Impatience is surface. The irony is that the more responsibility you accept, the less isolated you feel. Isolation thrives on perceived exclusion. Responsibility creates purpose. Purpose reorganizes alienation into direction. You stop asking, "Where do I belong?" You start asking, "Where can I build?" That shift is subtle, but decisive. Now we close this carefully, not dramatically, carefully. Final revelation. You felt out of place because something shifted, not suddenly, gradually, a widening of perception, a thinning of illusion, a refusal to fully settle into surface explanations. That shift destabilized your alignment with environments that once felt natural. You interpreted the destabilization as a flaw. It may be a phase. Blavatsky's layered model suggests that humanity is unfinished. That consciousness evolves in strata. That friction accompanies ascent. Whether you accept her cosmology literally as secondary, what matters is this: you are not static, and neither is the world. When awareness expands, the previous container feels narrow. That narrowing creates pressure. Pressure feels like exile, but exile is often a transition without a map. You now have a map, not of destination, of structure. The fracture you felt was not random. It was architectural. You sensed the limits of your environment because your perceptual depth had exceeded it. That does not make you superior. It makes you responsible. Responsible for integrating the expansion. Responsible for stabilizing coherence. Responsible for building a space where depth can operate without distortion. You are not misplaced in reality. You are between configurations, between the architecture that formed you and the architecture you are forming. Transition is unstable before it is powerful. If you endure it consciously, the next equilibrium will not feel like exile. It will feel like alignment, and alignment is quieter than alienation, but far more solid.